today. Thank you for generously giving us your time to be with us, either in person or online. My name is Kyla Raby, and I will be one of your co-hosts today, and I'm a co-author of the book that we're launching, Modern Slavery in Australia. My fellow host and co-author, Dr. Nerida Chazal, will be introduced herself shortly. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Kaurna people, the traditional custodians of the land that we gather on today, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. An important part of the discussion today will be about Australia's own history of slavery. The legacy of colonisation, including the impacts of forced labour fuelled by systemic discrimination, has had profound and enduring effects on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. By acknowledging these truths, we honour the resilience and the strength of First Nation Australians and commit ourselves to a path of reconciliation and justice. We're really fortunate to have Uncle James Michael Widdy Welsh with us today, who is a Kinchela Boys Home survivor, and he's joining us online with his colleague, Dr. Tiffany McComsey, to help us reflect on this history. So I would like to welcome them, and I look forward to hearing from them soon. I would also like to extend a special welcome and thank you to Rebekha Sharkie MP, the federal member for Mayo, who has made time in her very busy diary to be with us this afternoon and provide the keynote speech. And I've also just learnt that Rebekha's driven up from Victor Harbour, especially to be with us, and has to go back to Victor Harbour after this. So thank you so much. For those online, that's about an hour and a half away. We're very fortunate to also have the Northern Territory Anti-Discrimination Commissioner, Jeswynn Yogaratnam, with us online, and several other fantastic panellists who you can see here on the stage, who will be introducing a little later on. I would also like to welcome and acknowledge anyone with lived experience of modern slavery and exploitation, and to provide a content warning to the whole audience that we will be discussing topics this afternoon that may be upsetting or triggering for some people. So please do feel free to step out at any point if you need to. For those of you who don't know me, I have spent the best part of the last decade working to prevent and address modern slavery and human trafficking in Australia, as well as the United Kingdom, Greece and Bangladesh. I'm a practitioner by heart, a researcher by head, and an educator by soul. And I've had the privilege of working with and learning from survivors of modern slavery in several contexts. For the past 12 months, I've been running a social media project called Everyday Slavery, which is funded by the Commonwealth Government through our Modern Slavery Grant. The project aims to enable the public to play a greater role in helping to prevent and address modern slavery, both in Australia and global supply chains. On the screen, you can see a handle for Everyday Slavery Instagram account. And you can go onto the Instagram account and you can have a look at the story. And we're asking you to participate in some of the key topics that we'll be discussing today. We're asking you your thoughts on those. So we've been collecting responses from the audience for the last 24 hours through this method. And you can go on and do that now if you'd like to. And hopefully some of you already had a chance to. We'll be sharing those responses with the panellists today as part of our questions to them. We've also collected some questions online from the audience through this method, and we'll have an opportunity to ask questions to our panellists at the end. I will now hand over to Dr. Nerida Chazal.
Fabulous. Thank you, Kyla, and welcome everyone. It's so lovely to see our beautiful, supportive colleagues and friends and special family members as well up the front here. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedules to join us today and talk about this important issue. So my name's Nerida Chazal and I'm a senior lecturer in criminology at University of South Australia and also an anti-slavery researcher. And today is a special day as it marks the International Day for the Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its abolition. It's a really important day for us to reflect on how slavery has shaped Australia's past. Too often, slavery is framed as an external problem, as not something that has impacted Australia profoundly. But as Kyla mentioned at the start, slavery has been a key part of Australia's history of colonisation. In addition, slavery is not a thing of the past. Modern forms of slavery continue in Australia today. Recent data from the Australian Federal Police indicates that they received 382 reports of modern slavery in the previous financial year. However, as we know, modern slavery is a really hidden crime. Research conducted by one of our panellists, Sam Lyman, today from the Australian Institute of Criminology has found that for every one victim detected, there are another 4 that remain undetected. So it's really just the tip of the iceberg, the AFP numbers. Some other context for this is numbers from the Walk Free Foundation. And in their Global Slavery Index, they estimated that in 2021, there were 41,000 people living in conditions of modern slavery in Australia. So these numbers are really harrowing, and it is clear that the complexities of modern slavery, including its embeddedness in global supply chains, means that we will continue to see modern slavery as a part of Australia's future. This is why, to mark the International Day for the Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its abolition, we wanted to look not just at slavery in Australia's past, but also what's happening currently, and look towards the future in what we can do to help tackle this crime. Now, Kyla and I have been working together for about 5 years now to provide evidence-based solutions to some of the most complex problems associated with modern slavery. And I'm sure, as our partners would attest, every time that Kyla and I meet, we have a new project on the go. But this one was particularly special to us, and it was a very big one. The book that we're launching today, Modern Slavery in Australia, is really the culmination of our work together over the past 5 years. And this has included work consulting and supporting survivors, leading research projects, working collaboratively with many of the fantastic organisations and individuals in the space. We've been advocating for changes to legislation and policy, and now developing courses and presentations to raise awareness of modern slavery throughout Australia. In writing this book, our intention was for it to be a very practical tool for anyone working in this space to navigate the very complex and multifaceted legal and policy landscape of modern slavery. Modern slavery spans a vast terrain. It encompasses international law and human rights, federal and state criminal law, business law, industrial relations law, family law, and migration law. And increasingly, we are looking at the fields of business, sustainability, and global supply chains. So it's quite a lot of legal space to cover in the course of one book. So we found that writing the book to cover all of these diverse areas, challenging to say the least. But what we really liked about the process of writing the book was all the wonderful discussions that we had together, where we really learned a lot and found more problems to solve in the future. And also had some wonderful discussions with colleagues in the space, many of whom are here today, either in person or online, and they provided some feedback and comments on the book, which was really valuable. So we thank them for their participation in the book and here today. So, with all of that context, we will now move forward, and without further ado, I will ask Kyla to present our keynote speaker, Rebekha Sharkie.
Thanks very much, Nerida. So I'm going to introduce Rebekha and then invite her to our proxy lectern. Thanks very much. So Rebekha Sharkie MP represents the regional electorate of Mayo in South Australia in the Australian House of Representatives and is a member of the Centre Alliance Party. First elected in 2016, Rebekha is the first woman to represent her electorate and is now the longest serving female House of Representative crossbench member since Federation. Pretty impressive. Just some of the issues that Rebekha champions in the Parliament include aged care reform, climate action, regional housing, employment and infrastructure, political donation reform, gambling reform, and of course, honesty, integrity and accountability in politics. Rebekha has also been a supporter of strong regulation to prevent and address modern slavery and has been a champion for the introduction of a forced labour import ban, introducing a private member's bill to that effect in 2021. I'll now hand over to Rebekha.
Thank you. Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Yep. Well, I thought I would read you from the preface of this wonderful book. Slavery has existed in one form or another since the beginning of human civilization. Despite the abolition of legal slavery, the practice of slavery perseveres. No continent, country, or context is immune, as wherever human beings coexist, so does the potential for them to exploit one another. Every day, people in every corner of the globe come face to face with the dark side of humanity through the experiences of enslavement. a 15-year-old Tongolese girl is brought to France under the pretense of working as a housemaid and then is forced to work 7 days a week from early morning to late evening without any pay. A husband and wife bring an Indian national to Australia to undertake childcare and housework for their family and enslave her for 8 years in their home. They use her limited English skills, her unfamiliarity with Australia, and her lack of money to control her, rendering her entirely dependent on them for her welfare and medical needs, which is wholly ignored. Well, I don't want to say pleased to join you, but I am pleased to join you for this very important book launch on the International Day for the Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its Abolition, and to launch this very important piece of work that has been a true labour of love for both of you for 5 years, pulling it together, or roundabout several. You've done all of this in 1 year.
6 months.
My goodness, that is extraordinary. You need to come to the Parliament because we need people who work on things quickly. Okay, I'd like to acknowledge both of the authors and the panellists that are here today, and to everyone who's here either in person or online. Thank you for being part of this very important discussion. And as we know, while slavery has been outlawed in modern society, modern slavery still persists. It exists where coercion, threat or deception are used to exploit victims and limit freedoms many of us take for granted. Modern slavery in the form of human trafficking, servitude and forced labour, particularly with respect to debt and visa bondage, forced marriage and child labour, is found in every country. And so this book, The Past, the Present and Future of Modern Slavery in Australia, brings together the discussion of our nation's history, our legal and policy frameworks, data and compelling case studies to tell some of the human stories of historical and modern slavery. Now, Kyla and Nerida, now have I said your name correctly? Close?
Nerida.
Nerida, excellent. Examine our past and our policy and legal responses in recent decades to modern slavery. And most importantly, you identify the key emerging issues and policy responses that are likely to be effective. And I congratulate both of you on this incredibly important work. Now, I've been asked to speak about some of my work in the Parliament and the work of the Parliament more generally in this space. And while it's tempting to think of this as a historical issue, the Global Slavery Index estimates that 41,000 people will still be experiencing slavery even in Australia today. Of an estimated 50 million people subjected to modern slavery worldwide, 28,000 are in forced labour and 22 million in forced marriage. And it's estimated that more than 10 million of those forced into labour are children, robbed of their opportunities of a childhood, of families, of their health, their safety, and of course their access to education. Cheap food and clothes, and of course we live in a world of throwaway fashion, often comes at a very high human cost of forced and sometimes child labour. And to this end, in the last Parliament, I introduced my Customs Amendment banning goods produced by forced labour bill, and I introduced that in 2021 so that Australia would not be the endpoint for services and products made by forced labour. Now, the thing with private members' bills is while they will be discussed in the Parliament, they're not always debated, and certainly whoever's in government likes to put their bills forward rather than private members' bills. But what it does is it gives a point of discussion and pushes governments to actually look at this as an issue, and it might not be part of their suite of legislation that they're looking to adopt, but certainly there have been many private members' bills over the years that have been adopted as government bills. And so while this bill did not become law, since that time, the Parliament has responded, in part to the 2023 statutory review of the first 3 years of operation of Australia's Modern Slavery Act 2018 that was led by Professor John McMillan. In terms of funding, the government has committed, and I think it's important that I acknowledge that, $8 million over 4 years in the 2023-2024 budget to support the establishment and operation of the Commonwealth Anti-Slavery Commissioner, $2.5 million over 2 years for a modern slavery audit of government supply and procurement chains, and just over $12 million over 5 years for a forced marriage specialist support program, which I think is absolutely critical. And lastly, $2.2 million to extend the Speak Now project, also aimed at preventing forced marriage. With the recent passage of the Modern Slavery Amendment, Australian Anti-Slavery Commissioner Bill in 2023, the Commonwealth Anti-Slavery Commissioner will be established in line with the review's recommendations. And the Commissioner will oversee the fight against slavery in Australia and overseas and foster compliance with the Modern Slavery Act. And the Commissioner will seek to improve transparency in supply chains, raise the profile of modern slavery through education and awareness, and provide resources to support victim survivors of modern slavery. However, my understanding from civil groups such as Be Slavery Free is that there are gaps in the role of the Commissioner, and human rights experts have argued that the Commissioner's role is narrowly constrained and that the Commission will require greater independence, sufficient resources, which always seems to be something when it comes to managing humans. We seem to have a lot of money for submarines, but not for people, and strong investigative and enforcement powers to be truly effective. During the debate on the bill, I tabled a range of amendments, and I'll be continuing to advocate for these with government over my time in the Parliament. And those amendments included requiring Australian entities and businesses to help the Commissioner and to address modern slavery, requiring them to undertake due diligence processes to address the risks of modern slavery practices in operations and supply chains, not just risk reporting. Increase the Commission's focus on helping to identify and provide support, assistance and referrals for victim survivors, and enable the Commissioner to provide advice to the Minister on modern slavery matters on their own instigation, and set a 3-year timeframe for review of the Commissioner's budget to ensure that they are properly and adequately resourced. And I'll continue to do all I can and work with my colleagues to improve the legislation in this place, including the awareness, which I think is so incredibly important, particularly for young people who perhaps might not be necessarily thinking about where their clothes come from and the impacts on the person who made them. I recognise the Commissioner will make some practical improvements to the state of modern slavery in Australia within our nation's supply chain. And I look forward to working with the sector and, as I said, all my fellow parliamentarians to make this something that truly is in our past. So I would like to thank Nerida and Kyla for so much for your research and your analysis, which I cannot believe you have done in 6 months. That is extraordinary work. And to all the policymakers and legislators that do this great work, we have the capacity in Australia to truly ensure that every person in Australia has a life that is free from slavery, free from any sort of bondage or forced labour or forced marriage. And it's incumbent upon all of us to play our role to make this happen. Thank you, and congratulations on an extraordinary piece of work.
Thank you so much, Rebekah. And we would really like, on behalf of the whole sector, I think it's fair to say, to thank you for the championing of modern slavery, stronger laws that you have done in the Parliament. It's so great to have an advocate on this cause, and we know that you've the range that you've just outlined in your speech has been the impact of that has been really significant. So thank you. So I just want to pick up on some of the things that you mentioned in your speech and just ask you a follow-up question before we let you go. So you mentioned the review of Australia's Modern Slavery Act. Now we know Australia's Modern Slavery Act was intended to help address modern slavery in global supply chains. Now, despite it being in force for nearly 6 years now, every day Australian companies are profiting from selling goods and services made with modern slavery to Australian consumers. In particular, Chinese government state-sanctioned Uyghur forced labour is incredibly prominent in the goods and services that we purchase. We have a really large Uyghur community here in Adelaide, all who have had a family member or friend forcibly taken into a re-education camp, many of which are used to create the cheap goods that are embedded in global supply chains. Countries such as the United States, Canada, and now more recently the European Union have implemented legislation to ban the import of goods made with forced labour into their territories. But despite the many efforts, including from your own, we have no such legislation here in Australia. Now, through Everyday Slavery, we asked the audience who they felt was most responsible for ensuring the things that they buy are not made with modern slavery. And we had a lot of people say government, but we also had a lot of people say consumers. So consumers really do see this as their responsibility, but need that legislative support, I think, from government. So my question to you is, I guess, what do you think really needs to happen in order for our political leaders to take stronger action to stop this?
Can everyone hear me through the mic? Okay. Okay. Oh, here we go. There's definitely more work that I need to do on this. And I would like to acknowledge my former colleague, former Senator Rex Patrick, who initially took a bill with respect to forced labour with respect to the Uyghur community. So I think there's a lot more that we can do. I think governments are often a little bit nervous or hesitant in taking very strong positions, or perhaps singling out certain countries because obviously there's trade implications. But I think we can perhaps look at what other nations have done. You know, you've mentioned Canada, and there's no reason why we can't strengthen our own legislation and continually keep a microscope over it, I think. Yeah, there's more work to do.
Thanks so much, Rebekha. And I love how you mentioned keeping it on the radar of our politicians and letting them know that it's important to their constituents. So one thing a lot of people ask me when I'm talking to them about this stuff is, what can I do? And it might sound like it doesn't have much impact, but actually sending an email to your MP to tell them something is important to you would have a significant impact. Yeah.
Can I tell you how important that is? I check the inbox for my office, and then I share them with Tabitha and some of my other staff. And I receive quite a few hundred emails a day. But when there are certain issues that people raise, and once you have a number of people that raise those issues with you, truly, an MP would not be doing their job if they didn't realise that's an issue and take it to their party room. I mean, with me, I'm a party of one, so that makes it a bit tricky. But you can, it's about putting it on the radar, and certainly those campaigns. Many of you would remember the I Give a Gonski campaign from, I don't know, about 14 years ago. That was incredibly powerful in raising, I guess, the consciousness of all MPs that they need to work on this issue. And we have, had a number of them in the environmental space. So yes, I think if you care about this issue, write to your local member of parliament. And while, a stock stand campaign's good, if you can clearly articulate your own personal experience, your own personal thoughts, and give your details and ask for a meeting with your member of parliament, they're there to meet with you, and the senators. Don't forget the 12 senators we have in South Australia. It's about making sure that that advocacy happens, because if it comes from the community, it's far more powerful than coming from another member of parliament alone.
Thanks so much for reiterating that. I'd like to just give one more round of applause to Rebekha before we let her go. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much, Rebekha, for your words and your kind words about our book and for your insight there. Well, as we mentioned at the start, it's the International Day for the Remembrance of the Slave Trade. And if we're thinking about that in Australia, it's important to think about the experience Aboriginal people have had in slavery. And so I am personally really excited to welcome our next guests online to give us that perspective. We have Uncle James Michael Widdy Welsh and Dr. Tiffany McComsey, both from the Kinchela Boys Home Aboriginal Corporation. So I can see Tiffany there and I can see Uncle Michael there too. So Tiffany and Michael, I will introduce you both and then I'll have a question for you, but just thanks for joining us. So Dr. Tiffany McComsey is the Chief Executive Officer of the Kinchela Boys Home Aboriginal Corporation. She holds a PhD and an MA in Social Anthropology from the University of Manchester, UK, and a BA from New York University, USA. Since 2005, she has been involved with the national, state and local Aboriginal focused organisations and campaigns on a number of levels. These organisations have included the New South Wales Sorry Day Committee, National Sorry Day Committee, Just Reinvest New South Wales, and she was also a member of the Law Society of New South Wales Indigenous Issues Committee. So welcome, Tiffany, and thank you so much for joining us. We also have there Uncle Michael James Widdy Welsh. Uncle Michael James Widdy Welsh is a proud wild man from Cornwall in Central Western Plains of New South Wales. He is a stolen generations survivor who at the age of 8 was kidnapped from his mother. He, along with 5 other siblings, were taken from his mother by the police and then further separated from each other. Only Uncle Michael and his brother Barry were kept together, both sent to Kinchela Boys Home. At Kinchela Boys Home, he was given the number 36 and his brother 17. They remained in KBH for 5 years. Uncle Michael went on to establish some of the first Aboriginal organisations in Cornwall. He had been a member of the Kinchela Boys Home Aboriginal Corporation since 2009. He is employed as a KBH peer social support and emotional wellbeing worker and has been on the board of directors holding the position of treasurer between 2011 and 2020. And since 2020, he's been chairperson of the board. Uncle Michael is a member of the Healing Foundation's Stolen Generations Reference Committee, which guides the Healing Foundation's Stolen Generations work, ensuring it meets the unique needs of stolen generations, survivors and their family. Uncle Michael passionately believes in making sure his pain stops with him, and he is fighting to stem the intergenerational trauma in his family by restoring his family structure. He and other stolen generations are focused on truth-telling to ensure these acts of genocide are not forgotten, and so to ensure the policies inflicted on him, his siblings, and other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children are never repeated. Thank you so much for joining us. And just from reading out your bios, wow, we're so lucky to hear your perspectives here. The absence of recognition of how the treatment of First Nations Australians in Australia's history has amounted to slavery and slavery-like practices has been labelled as the Great Australian Silence. In the lead up to this event, we asked the audience of Everyday Slavery to indicate how well they felt they understood Australia's own history of slavery, and they responded overwhelmingly with not at all. And in thinking about this, I was struck by the poignance of a quote on the Kinchela Boys Home Aboriginal Corporation website, which says, "Unlocking our past is the key to freeing our future." So Uncle Widdy and Dr. McComsey, can you discuss how we can begin to change the narrative and awareness in Australia around the role that slavery has played in our past and how this is needed to improve our future? I'm not sure if Uncle Michael wants to go first or Dr. Tiffany.
I just want to thank you very much for identifying and talking there at the moment a little bit about the pain that we've all go through on this land that they now call Australia. And I've been in a journey of my life, and we've been blessed to have a person like Tiffany with us to move along this journey. And I'm learning. I get emotional when people are kind to me because we never had kindness. But I know that what I've got to do is I've got to keep on talking and keep the journey going, because we're only in the early stages of breaking free from that time of world where we lived in or never thought we had a right to anything. Simple little things that I like to point out. We don't want to blame anybody. We don't want anybody to be hurt or punished for where we're going. But we do want people to understand that we're asking for the right to be the people that we were supposed to be before they took us and reprogrammed our brains to be slaves for the colonized world of this country. And this part now, what I'm doing, speaking to you, I couldn't do that. I wasn't able to do that for lots of years. When I got old enough, I turned to alcohol. I didn't know why, but I've been told again, blessed to Tiffany and other people like that, that a trauma that was programmed into us. We had no rights. We had no love. The love that I knew was taken away from me when I was 8 years of age. And other brothers that's gone through this place where we've gone through, they have never, ever met their mothers and fathers again. They still carry the intergenerational trauma of their own from their parents, and then the trauma that they've lived through, going through. So with this, the Anti-Slavery Commission, I was so pleased. I was shocked when I first heard about it, because we just thought this was only happening to us. But we know now that there's thousands that have been suffering from this genocidal sexual activities and working forces for people to make them just richer for what they're doing. Family structure is the most important thing in my life. At the moment, I do have now my own children and my children's children. I have the trauma that runs through the veins of 57. And people say, oh my God, Uncle Widdy, they tried to breed your people out. They got no chance of breeding you out. That's one way of looking at it. But I've got 57 that's carries my intergenerational trauma. And this is something that runs through the bloodline, not only us, to each and every one of the people on this land that's been treated like that. So when I'm talking, I'm just talking, trying to, from my heart. And the things I was saying is trying to get people to understand a little bit about a pain that we have. We don't want to be compared to anybody else's pain. We don't want to say that we know how to fix somebody else's pain. Things like 2017 on the 11th of October, I was given the right to hone and speak my own language at the Government House in the Parliament, 2017. And people say, oh my God, but we can speak our language. I said, you could. This is a right that we've never had. We're only just starting to get it. This is what I'm doing here now, speaking to yous. I can't free myself unless I do this. The trauma inside of me was killing me from inside out. My silence, because they treated us that way, that they'd make us, that we wouldn't tell, couldn't tell. We're too frightened to tell. The abuse, not just with labour, the sexual abuse, the physical abuse, everything that they did to us. Out of 600 that went through that place, there's 50 of us left. So we need to put a foundation down so that our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and other people that are now coming and living on this island have a chance to be treated equal. I like my great CEO over there to have a bit of a talk, and I'm going to be quiet for a little while. But I do thank you for giving me a chance to voice my pain. And again, I must stress that we don't want this pain to go to anybody else. We want this to stop with us. Although the government says that they're sorry, they've got 15, 16 or 20,000 children at this moment that are still in out-of-home care. Now, those children in 15 years' time, 20 years' time, are going to be feeling the same pain that I've gone through. Thank you.
Thanks, Uncle Widdy. I'd like to start by acknowledging country as well. I'm here on Gadigal country, and the significance of being here in Redfern and Waterloo, I hope isn't lost on all of you in the space, because it was here in Redfern Park that then Prime Minister Paul Keating was the first Prime Minister to acknowledge the forcible removal of Aboriginal children. And that was the time of the Bringing Them Home report. And even before that, in the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, there were actually 2 of the individual deaths that were investigated were uncles who had been at Kinchela Boys' Home when they were young boys. And even then, in the early 90s, acknowledging that there was this pipeline of removing children and having them in out-of-home care that led them to the criminal justice system. And yet we still talk about realizing there's this pipeline today in 2024. What really excites us to be part of connecting the past policies that created the stolen generations with today's contemporary anti-slavery movement is by acknowledging that what the aunts and uncles here experienced was a form of slavery. We talk about so many survivors ask that question, why did this happen? And we know it was genocide. The question, though, that doesn't always get asked is, how did this happen? And when we hear that figure about 41,000 people in Australia living in conditions of contemporary slavery, we still haven't learnt the lessons of the past of how many hundreds of thousands of Aboriginal children were living in slavery when they were institutionalized after having been kidnapped from their families and communities. But even after institutionalization in childhood, sent on to properties or in factories across this country. And they were put into servant-like conditions, not paid wages directly, had that held in trust, not given any of the living and life skills to be able to live as young adults and then as adults to raise family. So much of that part of that history is still not well known. Why were there families that were taking in Aboriginal children to be domestic servants or to be cattle hands? So there's still so much that needs to be understood about the past to prevent some of the practices and experiences that are happening in the future. It's also bittersweet for us to be part of this space because so many of the aunts and uncles have passed since the time that they shared so much for the Bringing Them Home report. And their statements are there, their testimonies are there, the solutions to addressing their pain are there in those 54 recommendations. And those recommendations have, for the most part, not been fulfilled by state, territory, and federal parliaments. When I look at what is talked about today, and Uncle Widdy said it so poignantly, there are multi-generational families that have experienced this legacy who are not getting supported or resourced to rebuild their family structures. And it's getting out of a situation of slavery, whether it's the past or now. And what are we doing to allow them to a person to rebuild their lives? And what was it that was actually stolen from them in the experience of the stolen generations, but also here when a person is put into conditions of slavery? What do you have to do to heal that trauma? What do you have to do to rebuild your trust, your relationships with your family, with those who become your family? And how do you deal with the legacies where in the past, so many of the aunts and uncles were denied education, denied employment, so created an underclass within the Aboriginal community that we now talk about with closing the gap, this invisible gap that no one recognizes. And so our hope by being in this space now with you all, and we do a lot with the Anti-Slavery Commissioner here in New South Wales, is to bring those learnings of what government and organizations that support and work with survivors can reduce from happening compared to what happened for stolen generation survivors. It can't just narrowly be a suite of supports that is therapeutic based. You have to really support a survivor to lead the rebuilding of their lives and rebuilding of their connection to community. So thank you for allowing us to be part of this space and conversation. And we talk about when we're working with stolen generation survivors, there's this respectful urgency, because if we don't act to address those wrongs of the past, this will only go to future generations. And like Uncle Widdy said, he has 57 descendants, and that's children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. At what point and how do you stop the pain if survivors aren't leading this work to address their own pain and rebuild their families? Thank you.
Well, thank you both of you and Uncle Widdy for sharing your experiences. It's just such a touching way to start our panel session. And I think for all of us to reflect on, when I listen to you speak and when I've read your stories and what happened at Kinchela, there can be no doubt that that would amount to slavery in our current our laws, and that it was used as a tool of the genocide. And we continue to see slavery used as a tool of genocide today, as we touched on earlier with the Wager forced labour. So it's great to start with your reflections on that very traumatic past that continues to cause trauma today. So I thank you for sharing, and I hope that you can stay online for some questions at the end of the panel. And I will pass Kyla over to Kyla now to introduce our next panel member.
Thanks very much. So I'd like to now introduce Jeswynn Yogaratnam, who is Northern Territory Anti-Discrimination Commissioner. We might just see if we can get, there he is on the screen. So welcome, Jeswynn. So Jeswynn is a lawyer, an educator, and more recently, the Northern Territory Anti-Discrimination Commissioner. He's passionate about championing equality of opportunity and poverty alleviation by eliminating discrimination. Jeswynn's interest in modern slavery stems from his past tenure as a law academic in international human rights law and international humanitarian law, where he looked into gender violence in the post-conflict states. He's interested in supply chain reforms as a lever to addressing social determinants within environmental, social, governance, ESG frameworks that can track, monitor, evaluate and prevent modern slavery issues. Now, Jeswynn, I'm just going to pick up on a couple of the themes that our first panelist spoke about. In particular, Tiffany's question of the how did this history of slavery occur and how is it still happening now? Because I think one of the things that became really apparent to me in writing the opening chapter of the book, which is on the history of slavery, both in Australia and internationally, is that since the beginning of human civilization, discrimination has been a root cause of slavery, and it continues to be today. Discrimination based on race, gender, religion, social status, and sexual orientation results in certain groups being marginalised, lacking access to education, employment, and access to justice and equality of opportunity. This can make them more vulnerable to exploitation. So addressing discrimination is crucial to combating modern slavery, as it involves tackling the underlying factors that allow such exploitation to thrive. However, too often we tend to address social issues in isolation from one another, not recognising important intersections. And even more often, law and policy tends to focus on treating symptoms of social issues and not addressing root causes. So my question to you is, what opportunity do you see for the anti-discrimination and anti-slavery movements in Australia to learn from each other and to work together to address common goals?
Thank you, Kyla. Just checking, can you all hear me loud and clear? Fantastic. Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here in this session. Wow, what a powerful opening, and also Uncle Willie and Tiffany, that context of respectful urgency. That's clearly what we're trying to sort of achieve here. Just to sort of acknowledge that I'm streaming here from the energizing saltwater country of Larrakia Nation up in Garamela, Darwin, and just to acknowledge the traditional owners past, present, and rising. And a continued connection to land, country, and community. Now, in terms of that question, can I just break it down? And I think it's a great question because it allows you to think a little bit more laterally from the way in which we work in commission, which is quite silo, to then how can we work more collectively? Because one of the things that I think that I took away from what Uncle Willie was talking about, that we are actually agencies that are about truth-telling mechanisms, that we create those truth-telling mechanisms through our agencies. So the opportunity there is also in terms of better understanding how we can work within our commissions in terms of enhancing that truth-telling that we need to sort of further develop within our own spaces, but then open that space to more voices for that respectful urgency that we need to sort of achieve. But I'm saying this on the back of the fact that we need to first recognize that we here in Australia do not have a Human Rights Act, right? So as agencies, one of the things that we are working towards, especially when you look into the context of your modern slavery space, is about the way in which we can achieve those human rights for these people, the victim survivors. But also, it's really important from a migrant, let's just take from a migrant perspective, someone coming into Australia, which is perhaps my story and a bit of lived experience, is not understanding your rights because you do not have that overarching human rights instrument. So agencies like the Modern Slavery Commission and also the Anti-Discrimination Commission, the opportunity here is really to sort of learn from each other and work together. And I really like how we've phrased that question, Kyla, because it's about learning and working together for the common goal. And the common goal here is that human rights of these people that we're talking about, that fundamental right that we do not see enshrined, but we know it's in different spaces within the instruments in which we work in. Now, the other opportunity here, and this is, again, something to think about from the perspective of what's happening with a number of, human rights commissions, but also Anti-Discrimination Commission, and I'll perhaps speak more broadly in the context of the Northern Territory, is something called positive duty. So positive duty is really now a legal duty in the way in which we eliminate and prevent discrimination, sexual harassment, and victimization. And the reason I'm raising this is because, as what Kyla has pointed out, one of the root causes in the context of modern slavery is discrimination, or sometimes a bit of the chicken and egg situation, as what Kyla and I had talked about previously. But what we need to understand is how our commissions or our entities can work together in the context of embedding positive duty obligations within organizations that need to sort of adhere to these responsibilities. So how do you work in a proactive way? So you're not getting to that stage of a modern slavery issue, but rather how are you proactively developing some of those response and reporting mechanisms, the risk management protocols, so we can take that as the opportunity in terms of how we are mitigating some of these issues. So positive duty sort of is within 4 jurisdictions here in Australia at a federal level, 2022, that come about effective 2023. In the NT, it came into force in 2024. Now, the key thing with positive duty here, which is across all jurisdictions, or the 4 jurisdictions, so the NT, Federal, Victoria, and the Human Rights Commission and the Queensland Commission, including ACT, or 5 of them in total. The common ground here is sex discrimination. And why I'm raising this sex discrimination and sexual harassment, because those are common points of what we see in terms of modern slavery, the impacts that are in relation to what some of them suffer from: discrimination, sex discrimination, and sexual harassment. So the opportunity here is really in terms of how we can learn to embed some of the modern slavery, some of the positive duty thinking into your modern slavery frameworks. So we're not working in silo, but rather sort of working in cognizance of the fact that there are these other real effective instruments or frameworks that are out there that can also help deal with some of these triggers within the modern slavery space. Remember, the idea here is to mitigate so it doesn't become an issue, but also the idea here is how you can inform your supply chains to their positive duty performance, which becomes then embedded as part of your journey in your modern slavery reporting. It's really important to note, and this quote that's from a very famous abolitionist, William Wilberforce, where he says, "You may choose to look the other way, but you can never say again that you did not know." So modern slavery, provisions and also positive duty really speaks to that point that we can all, choose to look away, but you can never say you did not know. And what positive duty does is it creates those systems within the organization. So you are looking at it and you are developing the response and reporting mechanisms, and you are developing the risk management protocols. And importantly, you are sort of changing the culture in terms of how organizations look at the issue of modern slavery and the positive duty context. So it becomes part of the organizational identity. So we are mitigating so it does not become a problem to begin with. I'll perhaps pause there and take any comments or questions.
Thank you so much, Jeswynn. And when Jess and I know each other actually from a long time ago, from Darwin days, from IHL, International Humanitarian Law days, but when we caught up again last week and we were talking about this exact concept, we were really looking at the similarities between positive duty obligations and human rights due diligence. And as we know, in Australia at the moment, our Modern Slavery Act only has a transparency requirement, so a reporting requirement on businesses. It doesn't require them to actually take any specific actions. But hopefully we're moving in a direction like the rest of the world is, where in the future we may have obligations on businesses to undertake human rights due diligence, where they actually are required to take positive, proactive steps to prevent modern slavery and other social and economic, social and environmental harms in their actions. So we were considering about the alignment of positive duty obligations with that as well. So I think maybe consider this the beginning of the conversation, and we'll hopefully have some more questions for you at the end, Jeswynn. Thanks so much. I will now pass over to Nerida to introduce our next panellist.
Great. Thanks, Kyla, and thanks, Jeswynn. That was really great to hear your perspectives and thoughts. Our next panellist is Christine Carolan, who's here with us in person today. And Christine Carolan has worked on the issue of human trafficking since the Global Catholic Sisters Call for Action in 2001. Christine is Executive Officer of ACRATH, a collaboration of Catholic religious partners. ACRATH work to support victims and survivors, raise awareness, and advocate for systemic change. One aspect of Christine's push for change has been a successful annual advocacy week in Canberra in Federal Parliament, engaging on pressing human trafficking issues. And Christine is a real powerhouse and really well connected throughout the anti-slavery sector. So we are really pleased to have you with us here in person today, Christine. In chapter 2 of our book, we mapped out several key legal and policy developments that have occurred over the past 24 years since the Palermo Protocol first triggered an Australian response to the issue of human trafficking. And for those who are not aware, the Palermo Protocol is the main international law that relates to trafficking in persons. In the lead up to today's event, we asked the Everyday Slavery audience to indicate if they felt that non-government organisations have played a key role in shaping Australia's response to modern slavery, and everyone overwhelmingly agreed. Christine, you've worked in this space since the beginning of Australia's response, so are you able to share with us some of your reflections on any of the significant successes that you've experienced in your time?
Thanks, Nerida, and thanks, Kyla, for the invitation. And I want to acknowledge the terrific gathering of people. It's not loud enough, sorry. Yeah, sure. Okay, is this louder? I'm going to acknowledge Nerida and Kyla and the terrific panel that this has been so far. And thanks for the question. I think it has been a very exciting time across the time that I've been involved in counter-trafficking NGO work. And I vividly remember very early in or late last century and the very beginning of this century's hearing about young women who were trafficked into sex work in Australia, who found themselves very quickly arrested, I'm not sure for the crime, and were deported via the detention centres very fast. So that's not so long ago, and yet now that seems like an impossibility. And I think one of the things I would like to acknowledge in looking at like a really significant change is the network that's been involved in collaborating. That very often, I think it's a lot of the people online here today and people here in the physical audience have worked together, have very often said, this is not easy. Sometimes I have to step back and think, oh my goodness, we're NGOs together, but we're going to put our heads together and we will bring about this change by sheer bloody-mindedness. And I think the additional pathway onto the Support for Trafficked People program is a great example of that collaboration, including not just with the civil society groups, but also with departmental officers and with government. And it's a very clunky name for a project, but what it means is now that when somebody finds themselves a victim of slavery here in Australia, they can access support because they had a crime committed against them here in Australia. Before 3 weeks ago, you pretty much had to commit to a criminal justice response. And I think there's a huge difference in what's happened. And very excitingly, last week, that group who are running the additional pathway onto the Support for Trafficked People program said after only 9 days of operation, they'd been able to refer 4 people onto the support program. It's a huge number in 9 days. And I think it says that collaboration is going to offer many people, victims of slavery here in Australia, the sort of support that people should have access to. And I'll just do one, I mean, I've shouted out to the network for doing that, but also to the longevity of the commitment, because I think that need was named in a report to the United Nations in January 2006. It was led by Jennifer Byrne and Louise Cleary, and a whole lot of people collaborated on it. But that's a long time, 2006, to name the need, but we've stuck at it, and now it's a reality. Well, it's an 18-month trial, but we're going to make sure the trial works. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Christine, for those reflections. And I think the additional referral pathway, the significance can't be understated. So for those who are not familiar, there's many reasons why victims and survivors might not want to go to a police to report what has happened. But up until recently, they have had to do that to get the support from the government. And I think we were discussing at dinner last night, I mean, that would be unheard of for other crimes like domestic violence. You couldn't imagine having to go to the police to get some support for that. There's other organisations there. So that's what this additional referral pathway is about, is giving survivors that option to go to a different organisation and achieve that support without having to commit to being part of the criminal justice process, which can be really traumatising for survivors. So Christine and Kyla were instrumental in getting that up, and it's really a fantastic step forward. So thanks, Christine, for your reflections on that. So I'll pass back over to Kyla to introduce our next guest now.
Thanks very much. So I'm very, very pleased to welcome Umes, who is our next panellist. So Umes is from Nepal and came to Australia with his wife 9 years ago as an international student. He holds a bachelor's in developmental studies and a master of project management. Umes worked in the anti-trafficking sector in Nepal, where he was involved in the rescue and rehabilitation of Nepalese child survivors of child trafficking and child labour. He's a passionate advocate of social justice and equality for all, and is guided by the values of love, compassion, justice and equality. Umes has served his passions through movements like the Australian Young Christian Workers and Anti-Poverty Network, South Australia. He's been a community development worker with St Vincent's de Paul Society for 3 years. Now, it is well documented around the world that around the world and here in Australia, migrant workers are disproportionately impacted by labour exploitation and modern slavery. The Commonwealth Government has recently introduced several new laws to tackle migrant worker exploitation, which aim to deter employers and others in the labour chain from using a person's migration status to exploit them. And these are very welcome developments. Now, when I had the chance to interview you, Umes, a few months ago for Everyday Slavery, you shared with me your experience of being an international student and a migrant worker in Australia. And I was really struck by what you talked about, this survival mode culture that you encountered, which led to your own experiences of exploitation, and how this culture of survival that many international students face is almost like a rite of passage of coming to Australia. So I'm really interested to know from you, what else do you think needs to change, in addition to these kind of legal and policy changes that we've seen, to address this culture of survival and to ensure that international students and migrant workers in general are not being made vulnerable to exploitation simply by the act of coming to Australia?
First of all, thank you very much, Kyla, for that introduction. 9 years, it's been a long time in Australia, right? As you mentioned, before I came to Australia, I was working in anti-child trafficking sector in Nepal. So our job was to rescue, survivors of child trafficking from various parts of Nepal and from India, and then try to rehabilitate them back into the society, especially back into their community and with their parents and all. So that was my life back home. So I was in that other spectrum of when we talk about trafficking or modern day slavery. I was in that where you took action to really, rescue the survivors and all. But when I came to Australia, it took me a bit of time to really acknowledge, like, damn, I'm a victim here. Okay, so I was a champion there, in the other side of the spectrum. But coming to Australia, working in the hospitality industry and all, and slowly understanding the worker rights scenario in Australia and all, and then acknowledging, damn, I'm being victimized over here. I'm like a victim, so I need to do something about it, because I won't be able to call myself an advocate or of human rights if I don't do something that is happening to me personally and so many of my friends and my colleagues that were working in the hospitality industry at the time. So that was my first year in Australia, trying to understand what is happening to me. Being an international student, and then being not being acknowledged actually as a worker in Australia, because it is quite you talked about marginalization. I think for international students it is very true, because international student is a huge community in Australia, right? But by the word itself, it is international students. So everyone looks to them, to these young people who come to Australia. It's just students. But at the same time, what I was experiencing was like, these are workers, they are working too. And all the policies at that time, which I looked into, there were workers' rights policies, protecting the workers. But at the same time, there was not this any policy that was actually looking into this massive group of young people which was participating in Australia's labor market as actually workers. And that was marginalization, understanding of marginalization for me, because though it was a massive group, no one was acknowledging them as a significant part of the Australian labor market. So that was that one. And another funny part, and I think I would like to borrow your word again, normalization. I think that was what I was referring to at that time of the culture that you were talking about, because within that marginalized community, they were getting exploited. And my own personal experience was like, I was being paid like less than, more than 50% is less than the minimum wage. And I was accepting it. Okay, that is where the thing about survival comes into play. And another surprising and shocking part, and why I call it as a modern day slavery. Many people refer to this situation as just like wage theft, or like worker exploitation in a workplace, or a petty offense and things like that. But for me, it was more than that. For me, it was like personally, that is a word I say, modern day slavery for me. And then that experience was being normalized and accepted by this group of young people or young workers. And then that was shocking for me. So it called that we need to advocate more about this, because we cannot let this normalization continue, because as it continued, and then if it continues for a longer period of time, then it will be another form of slavery, or another form of modern day slavery in the world economy, or like anywhere I see international students, like in UK, America, Canada, Australia, everywhere. It is the similar situation, because this class of workers have been like severely marginalized, and then the policies or the regulations in the developed countries or the destination countries where these workers go to do not really see them as a part of like workers scenario. So that was that. So now comes the survival culture, like why it was being normalized. And then I try to reflect to myself too. Did I quit my job where I was getting exploited? The funny answer or the obvious answer was no, I did not quit it. The day I quit it, who is going to pay my rent? Who is going to pay for the basic needs that I needed for survival? No one was there out there to support me. So I continued to do that work for a long period of time, because I did not have any other options, and it was killing me. Telling you, being an advocate for human rights, and then being in that position to accept or like accept that situation, that was really hurting. And then that's why I say, like, it is just more than the dollar figure that we talk about, like $18 an hour or $10 an hour. It is much more than that, because it was killing me. And at the same time, I used to see a lot of my other friends whose situation was like more terrible, because a lot of the young people who came over here, it is not just that young person who is coming to Australia, or not just that the individual is coming to Australia. There are a lot of hopes and dreams attached to that person. That is where the problem becomes much more bigger than just an individual person. So that's why I always advocate it as a modern day slavery, because hurting that person, young worker, by a couple of dollars an hour, or like more than that an hour, is actually hurting a lot of the people who are dependent on that person, because a lot of the dreams and hopes are attached to that person. So that was that one. And then so that is where like that survival mode kicks in, because you're thinking about yourself, your survival. You're thinking about the tuition fees that needs to be paid every 6 months, and it is massive. It is very costly. Education in Australia for international students is like very expensive. Okay, and then some people argue like, why did you come to Australia? And all, but no one argues what were the factors that you took into account when you were making that decision to come to Australia as international student. And there's a lot of issues that I can talk about in that decision making, like scenarios, like role of stakeholders like universities, education agents, like roles of policymakers and all. So we can talk about that some other day. But I think all those factors, it is complex, but all those factors contribute to forcing that individual to be in that survival mode, and then like unwillingly accept those conditions, which I personally call as modern day slavery, but others might refer it in any other ways. But for me, that is modern day slavery. So yeah, that was my experience, I guess. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Umes, for sharing your experience with us. I think we could all agree it's a real privilege to hear that. And thank you. We appreciate it. Takes courage to share that. And I just want to reflect on a couple of points that you mentioned, which I think are really themes that we've already started seeing emerge from the conversation today. So the discrimination against international students and the need to have holistic responses. I think hearing what you were talking about, the struggle, we really need to be working not just in the anti-slavery movement to address this issue, but across all social issues. To be looking at how do we wrap around people that are becoming vulnerable because of certain situations, such as the marginalisation of international students. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. I'll hand back over to Nerida for our final panellist.
Thanks, Kyla, and thanks very much, Umes. Our next and final panellist is Samantha Lynham. Samantha is an internationally recognised expert and researcher on human trafficking and modern slavery. She currently leads the Australian Institute of Criminology's Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery Research Program, where she has published extensively on a range of issues, including forced marriage, sexual and labour exploitation, orphanage trafficking, and Australia's policy and legal response to these crimes. Recently, her work has focused on developing estimates of modern slavery victimisation in Australia, measuring the attrition of cases through the Australian criminal justice system, and understanding the role of technology in facilitating modern slavery. Internationally, Samantha has collaborated with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime on the interlinkages between trafficking in persons and marriage, and with statistical experts to accurately quantify the prevalence of modern slavery victimisation using multiple systems estimation methods. That's a really well-cited study that I quoted at the start, with the one for every one victim, another 4 go undetected, which is really valuable and important work. So thanks, Sam. Sam is currently undertaking a PhD at UNSW to better understand issues of consent and coercion, in cases of forced marriage. She also holds a Bachelor of Social Science in Criminology, Social Research and Policy from UNSW, and a postgraduate diploma in Arts in Criminology from the University of Melbourne. So very lucky to have you here today. Sam, chapters 3 and 4 of our book are dedicated to Commonwealth criminal laws in relation to slavery and slavery-like practices and trafficking in persons. In writing these chapters, Kyla and I really grappled with the task of trying to explain why certain practices have been charged as certain offences and not others, and why indeed some offences have never been used despite the behaviour being present in some cases. Inconsistencies between Australian law and international law, and a lack of understanding of the really complex elements of slavery and trafficking are just some of the challenges faced in prosecuting modern slavery offences in Australia. It might surprise some people to know that as of June 2022, only 31 people have been convicted of human trafficking and slavery offences against the Divisions 270 and 271 of the Criminal Code. And that's since the legislation came into effect. And this is despite thousands of reports being made to AFP and almost 600 people identified as victims and referred to support during this time. So that's a real gap there between the number of survivors and those who are being convicted for these offences. In the lead up to this event, Through Everyday Slavery, we asked the audience to indicate if they felt on this basis that our criminal laws are effective, and unsurprisingly, based on those statistics, the majority said no. So Sam, my question for you is that these laws underwent a public review last year. Can you tell us about some of the key areas where future reform has been recommended and why?
Nerida. So firstly, to acknowledge, I suppose, that 31 convictions is extremely low over that period of time. So we're talking 1 to maybe 2 convictions a year. And so the review of Australia's legislation on human trafficking and modern slavery happened towards, or the report was handed down towards the beginning of last year. But prior to that, I was fortunate enough to undertake a study where I was able to access police data from the Australian Federal Police and prosecution data from the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions for all human trafficking and modern slavery matters that have been investigated and prosecuted since the legislation, even prior to the legislation, because we did have some sexual servitude offences prior to the human trafficking and modern slavery legislation coming into effect. And the purpose of the analysis was to chart the progression or the attrition of matters through various stages of the criminal justice process. And then I was also fortunate to interview 22 criminal justice practitioners to ask them why they thought the conviction rate was so low. And what I found through that study is that half of people referred by the Australian Federal Police after an investigation to the Commonwealth prosecutors for suspected human trafficking and modern slavery offences were subsequently charged. So already there's a huge amount of attrition through the investigation process. The police have decided that a case shouldn't progress to a prosecution. But then of the charges that were laid for human trafficking and modern slavery, of all the charges that were laid for those people who were then prosecuted, 60% of those charges related to human trafficking and modern slavery offences in our Commonwealth Criminal Code. There were also 40% of charges that were laid for related kind of offences, so things like migration offences, prostitution offences, and child sex offences. And so it showed that prosecutors are willing to lead with those more serious offences, but they do charge, with a range of offences that might be appropriate in that situation, that might have been present in that situation. But the thing is that only 20% of those human trafficking and modern slavery charges resulted in a conviction. And that compared to almost half of the charges for those other offences, the migration offences. So they are very difficult to receive a conviction. So while defendants were most likely to be charged with those more serious human trafficking offences, the alternative charges were the ones that were actually receiving the convictions. So I thought that was really quite revealing. And through those interviews, criminal justice practitioners gave a range of reasons why this might be. First of all was the poor quality of victim evidence and testimonies. So, they found that victims, due to complex trauma and fear of retribution, misunderstanding of criminal justice processes, fear of the police, would tend to lie or omit details. And that's also due to the memory effects and recall effects of trauma as well. So it can be really difficult for victims of human trafficking and slavery to actually piece together in a logical and coherent way what has happened to them, especially if that trauma has happened over a long period of time. And so victims have been found to be quite unwilling to cooperate in criminal justice investigations, or even when they have chosen to cooperate, prosecutors have decided to end a case or withdraw a case because they don't believe that the witness is going to appear as credible and that a jury is going to be able to understand their situation and choose to convict an offender. The other thing that they raised was the complexity of the legislation and there being a lack of case law. We've only got those 31 cases. That's not a lot of case law to deal with. And so they told me that the legislation involves, for a start, there are a lot of provisions in the legislation, but then there are a lot of elements that need to be proven in a human trafficking case. And we're working with really imprecisely defined concepts. So things, really heavy things like coercion, vulnerability, ownership, what it means to take advantage of another person. And so this ultimately leads prosecutors to use those other charges that they think will have a higher likelihood of conviction, but what might also carry an equal penalty. So something like a child sex offence can have an equal penalty to a human trafficking offence. So they've decided to use that legislation instead. And then the final thing is that, that federal crimes typically don't involve victims and definitely don't, tend to involve really highly traumatised victims. And so criminal justice practitioners don't feel like they are equipped to be able to effectively engage with such a complex victim cohort to be able to support them through criminal justice processes. So the review of the legislation happened last year, and it was an independent review, and there were 22 recommendations that came out of that review. And I've just pulled out the ones that I think are aimed at addressing some of those problems that I've just talked about. So the first recommendation is to streamline the large number of human trafficking and modern slavery offences that exist, to be able to simplify the legislation. And then the other recommendation is to clarify or provide definitions and provide additional guidance for some of those really complex terms. So things like being significantly deprived of personal freedom. You know, what does that mean? What does that look like? And can we attach a set of indicators to that to be able to think through what that actually looks like in someone's life? The second thing was about providing guidance on the reasonable person test. So juries are asked to essentially put themselves in the victim's shoes, you know, to be able to consider whether a reasonable person with the same background and the same circumstances as a victim would have felt like they had their personal freedom removed, or whether they were not able to cease providing labour or services. And that's something that's incredibly hard to do when we don't have a similar background to someone who's highly traumatised, who may have migrated from overseas, has experienced severe socioeconomic hardship. There are a whole lot of, you know, sort of vulnerabilities for human trafficking and modern slavery victims that an everyday person might not be able to understand. So the recommendation here is to provide more guidance around that, or in fact to remove it, remove that test altogether, so that more consideration is placed on the offender and their actions and their intentions, rather than focusing on the victim. The next one, which I think is a really important one, and really, yeah, it's been a long time coming, I think, is to remove specific references to the sex industry. It's the only industry that is identified in our legislation. So it's kind of singled out there, and, you know, I think removing it would really reinforce our understanding that exploitation can happen in any industry, and it sort of doesn't bias us towards thinking that exploitation only happens in the sex industry. And then the final one is just about strengthening the non-punishment principle. Sometimes victims of trafficking are forced to commit criminal acts or, breaches of the law, basically in the context of being a victim of human trafficking or modern slavery. And internationally, you know, that there's some very strong provisions around not punishing people who commit criminal acts in the process of being a victim of trafficking, and we don't quite have that in Australia. So I'm pleased to see that recommendation there, to be able to strengthen that so we can, you know, support and protect victims even further. They're my reflections. Thank you.
That was really well explained, Sam, and thanks for summarising those complex issues for us and for your research. So we'll wrap it up now, but we've got maybe just a couple of minutes for any questions. Anyone in the audience or online, if you have any questions for our panellists.
Anyone in the audience?
What was that, Mia?
Toddler. I'll just repeat the question for those online. The question was, when was the research that Sam has talked about in terms of the estimates of modern slavery victimisation conducted?
Yeah, so the data that we were able to get for that study was from 2015 to 2017, so 2 years. So, you know, it is a number of years since that study has been conducted. The positive thing is that we now, as of this year, and hopefully our report will be released next month, have developed the national minimum data set on human trafficking and modern slavery. So that was a one-off study to be able to test whether we could bring data together from different sources, use, you know, some fancy statistical techniques to be able to estimate the number of victims. But we've now got an ongoing data collection that does that, brings together data from a range of different agencies, so that we can do something like an estimate, you know, maybe on an annual basis going forward. So watch this space.
I'm not someone that normally gets excited over data, but I can't tell you how excited I am for this to be coming soon, because I think it's going to really help with understanding, one, the prevalence, but also different trends and different gaps in the space. So thanks, Sam.
Yeah, great. That's exciting to know. Any other questions? Is there anything online, Melissa?
Well, then.
There is one actually.
Brilliant. So has there been any studies or strategies discussed with financial institutions about how we how we target the offenders that profit from exploiting humans? Yeah, that's a really great question. Thank you, Jackie, for asking that. I'm actually not aware of any that's happened in Australia, but I used to work in the UK for some time, and I know in the UK context there was a lot more focus actually on doing, as you say, taking the money out of committing crime, so following the money trail, using the money trail to actually help in prosecutions. As Sam discussed in her brilliant reflections, we have a really heavy reliance on victim testimonial in Australia in order to achieve prosecutions. One of the reasons why we have such low prosecution rates, and that's not the case in other jurisdictions. They've used a lot of other techniques, such as that kind of following the money to help with achieving prosecutions. But does anyone else on the panel know of anything like that in Australia or elsewhere? Okay, thanks for the question. Jeswynn, did you want to speak to that?
Well, just to quickly add that, there are proceeds of crime legislation, and that's perhaps one sort of statutory instrument that could help with the tracing and the recovery of, whatever proceeds that have been made out of that. So that's one avenue to look at.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Thanks so much for adding that, Jess. We're right on 5 o'clock now, but happy to take one last question if anyone has one for any of our panelists.
Sorry, after 9 days, we've already 4 referrals. Just out of curiosity, is that just South Australia or Australia-wide? Australia-wide. Awesome. Thank you. Just wondered.
Great, thank you. And promising numbers there. Well, great, excellent. Thank you so much for all of our panellists. It has been wonderful to hear from you all, and such a diverse range of perspectives, which is really true of this field. It just encompasses so much, from, international students to human trafficking and research, and our past that we heard from Uncle Widdy. So thank you to our range of panellists. I'll hand over to Kyla just to wrap up the proceedings, but just thank you.
Yeah, can we give them one more big round of applause? I think we'll all agree it's been a really rich conversation, one that I wish we had many, many more hours to speak about. Hello, darling. Do you want to come up? Come up. Oh. Yeah, okay. This is my daughter, Mia, coming up. One that I wish that we had a lot more time to be able to, you're helping me promote it, that we would have all day to discuss, I'm sure. But I guess that is also a connection to the book. Thanks, Mia. If you are interested in learning more about many of these issues, please do check out the book. It is available in a lot of libraries. So if the cost is prohibitive to you, I totally understand it's quite expensive. Please do borrow it from the library or ask your local library to bring it in. But also, one thing that we often get asked, as I mentioned earlier, is people say, what can we do? And coming to an event like this where you hear about obviously really difficult concepts, it's sometimes not much nicer to walk away thinking, what can I do about this? So I just wanted to say 2 really important things that you can do is learn more about the issue, either through this book or many, many other books or free resources on the internet, courses. There's so much out there that can help you learn about this issue, and also help raise awareness. Oh, you're going to come join. Thank you. Help raise awareness. So if you haven't already, I invite you to follow Everyday Slavery and to share some of the awareness raising materials on there. We don't want you to fall off the stage, darling. Let's go here. And we'll also be posting the recording for today's event on the Everyday Slavery YouTube channel, and we'll send a link out to everyone who registered for the event in case people weren't able to attend live. So I'll finish there. Actually, sorry, just one more very, very big thank you, in particular to Nerida and I's families. We spent a lot of time writing this book, a lot of time out of office hours writing it. And so huge thanks to our family and friends for supporting us through that, including babysitting duties and looking after our loved ones for us. And then one more huge thank you to our panellists. And we've got a little gift for them to say thank you for their time. It is South Australian Hague's chocolate, one of the more ethical chocolates that you can buy. And we'll wrap up there. Thanks so much, everyone.
Great. Thanks, everyone.